in to AJU Open, AJU's fantastic resource for online learning and digital education. If this is your first time with us, welcome. We're so happy you're here. If this is your 20th time with us, we are so glad that you are back, and welcome even more. My name is Alyssa Silva once again, and I'm excited to introduce our host, our special host for this program, Dan Friedman. He is an award-winning writer and editor and was formerly the executive director of The Forward and director of content and communications at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He wrote for several Sacha Baron Cohen projects, and his work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He has a doctorate in comparative literature from Yale and a master's degree in English literature from Cambridge, where he captained the university soccer team. That's amazing. Truly a jack of all trades there. So Dan, thank you so much for being here, and I will leave it to you to introduce our fantastic speaker, Mike Rothschild.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. So Mike and I are going to discuss Jewish space lasers, the history of the Rothschilds, his book, of course, and we'll have a time for your questions later. So just put them in the Q&A and we'll come to them later. So I want to introduce our real guest of honor today. So Mike Rothschild is a journalist, an author, and the foremost expert on the ever-changing and always perplexing QAnon conspiracy theory, which is how I first read his work. He's a contributing editor for the Daily Dot, where he explores the intersections between internet, culture, and politics through the lens of conspiracy theories. So he spends a lot of time thinking about conspiracies of all sorts and shapes. As a subject matter expert in the field of fringe beliefs, Mike has been interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Yahoo, among many others. He's also a frequent speaker and podcast and radio guest on the topic of conspiracy theories, including NPR's weekly show On the Media, and he's also done work with Vice and appears in their documentary on those things. So welcome, Mike.
Well, thank you. I will attempt to live up to that introduction.
I'm sure you will. So I just wanted to, let's just start with the book, which is really why we're here. And so tell us, how did you come to write the book after working on QAnon?
So, as people hopefully know by now, my last name is Rothschild, and I am not related to the banking family. And growing up, nobody thought we were. I lived in a split-level house in the Chicago suburbs. I didn't know any banking tycoons, didn't own even one vineyard. It's just not something that anybody ever thought about. But, fast forward a few decades, I start writing about conspiracy theories. And I start getting a lot of comments. Oh, a Rothschild talking about conspiracy theories. The Matrix must be broken. How stupid do they think we are? Ha ha. And after, years and years of that, you start to think, well, there's a reason why these people think that the Rothschild family are these global string pullers. Maybe that's a good thing to write about. So I'd written a little bit about some Rothschild Facebook memes and other conspiracy theories. But in doing the QAnon book, I really realized just how embedded in the fabric of fringe paranoia the Rothschilds really are. So I decided to just dive in whole hog and write a book about who they are not, and what their impact has been on conspiracy culture.
Right. So just we're going to dig really into who they are, who they're not, and that conspiracy culture. But first of all, remind us about the space lasers and that episode, because that's a bizarre thing. It really gives resonance to your book title, but I think that maybe certainly I needed to be reminded of what happened in the book, and maybe our audience does too.
Sure. So the Jewish space lasers catchphrase, meme, whatever you want to call it, it originates, but it's not mentioned in a Marjorie Taylor Greene Facebook post from 2018. Now, of course, this is before she's in Congress. She's just private citizen, CrossFit mama who has some questions about things. And the things that she has questions about are, what's really going on with those wildfires in California? It can't possibly be climate change. What if it's this space-based solar generator that was entangled in a conspiracy with Pacific Gas and Electric and Governor Jerry Brown and Dianne Feinstein's husband to clear land for a $77 billion high-speed rail boondoggle. And oh, one of the board members of PG&E is also a vice president at Rothschild Inc. Boy, doesn't that sound suspicious? And it really, in its kind of tone and its incomprehensibility, it's really no different than millions of other Facebook posts and tweets and rants from 2018 and 2019 talking about the California wildfires being set by a directed energy weapon. So this Facebook post just disappears for a while. And then after Marjorie Taylor Greene is sworn in as a member of Congress, it is discovered again by a Media Matters researcher and immediately goes viral. The idea of a Jewish space laser, it's not mentioned in the post. She never uses the word Jewish, but she talks about the Rothschild family. And everybody in that world knows that when you're talking about Rothschild Inc., you mean the Jews.
Right. So you have a natural disaster or a disaster of some sort. You have like a whole variety of different things that you attribute it to, and you try and blame them on, and then that group of things includes Rothschilds as a dog whistle for the Jews. That's kind of what you have. So
yeah, that's really what it is.
Yeah, and you don't talk about. I mean, and it's a really excellent example of how how people just latch onto the Rothschilds, to explain pretty much anything bad that's happened in their world. But you don't talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene much. She's borrowing a little bit from Alex Jones, and you commented that you can draw pretty much a straight line from him right back to the Napoleonic era. So can you give us just a little historical background of how we get from the Rothschilds in Frankfurt in the 18th century through to Alex Jones and then Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Sure.
So 300 years of history in a couple of minutes.
And go. So the Rothschilds themselves, were a prominent German Jewish banking family that came from the Judengasse, the Frankfurt Jews Lane. It was this tiny walled ghetto, and they worked their way up from being small-time loan makers and dealers in coins and metals to being tasked with hiding the vast fortune of the Elector of Hesse, who is one of the primary figures of the Holy Roman Empire in its death throes, one of the people tasked with electing the Holy Roman Emperor. And he was trying to hide this vast fortune from the Napoleonic forces that were encroaching on Frankfurt. So Mayor Amschel Rothschild and his oldest son, Amschel, come up with this system to essentially launder the money from Europe to England and back and forth to fund the effort against Napoleon. And the family makes an enormous amount of money very quickly. As I write in the book, Mayor Amschel Rothschild dies in 1812, and he's fairly prosperous. His son Nathan dies in 1836 as the richest man in the world. So they make a huge amount of money very quickly. And of course, when that happens, myths start to rise up, and with myths come conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. Now, in the case of the Rothschilds, that really starts about a decade after Nathan's death with an 1846 pamphlet that accuses Nathan, who's been dead for a decade, of being at the Battle of Waterloo, observing it so close he could smell the cannon smoke and see the faces of the dead men. He sees that Napoleon is about to be defeated. He jumps on his fine steed. He gallops across Europe at midnight, gets to the Belgian port of Ostend. He bribes a sailor to take him across the channel in a once-in-a-century storm, gets to the London Stock Exchange looking absolutely defeated and exhausted. The other bankers interpret this as a sign that Napoleon has won. They start selling their stocks. Meanwhile, Nathan is making hand signals and directing his underlings to buy up all these depressed stocks. The news of Waterloo comes in that Napoleon has been defeated. These stocks skyrocket in value, and suddenly Nathan Rothschild is the richest man in England and essentially controls the British Empire. Now, none of that is true. That not a single part of that happened, but it is a very enduring and appealing legend. So as the decades go on, anti-Semitic cranks and pamphleteers and authors seize on that legend as proof that the Rothschilds fund both sides of every war, control the vast majority of the world's resources, see the rest of us as their peons, and on and on and on. And this legend is repurposed by cranks in the US. It's repurposed by the Nazis in the early 1940s, and it is used by Cold War conspiracy theorists, people like Ezra Pound, Eustace Mullins, and on up to Alex Jones in the present.
That's great. That was 2 minutes and 12 seconds. So
All right. Hey, we've got a little time. We're going to take a walk.
that's pretty good. And I think, I mean, also you go on to talk about how, you know, how the facts really don't need to stand in the way of a good story, you know, and these stories endure for hundreds of years. You know, this is the early 19th century, this is 200 years ago. And also, you know, the book also talks about how they proliferate through the Muslim world, which didn't have the same tradition of anti-Semitism, and then into Asia, so to China, Korea. You don't really talk about Korea, but Korea, you talk about China and Japan, but Korea has a very similar, although different, situation from Japan in terms of people having an understanding of the Jews running the world. But how did they, why do you think that they continue to be such a target of anti-Semitic myths? Really, even, you know, so, you know, I'd say, according to your book, I think maybe after the Second World War, when they, you know, you could talk a little bit about what happened to them in the Second World War and how they sort of lost their power, and then, but how the myth endured, perhaps.
Sure. And the Rothschilds really did start to lose their power even well before the Second World War, really going into the First World War, when England and France needed a loan to fund the fight against Germany. They went to JP Morgan. It was Morgan and a consortium of American bankers who made the $500 million Anglo-French loan. The Rothschilds in France maybe made some introductions, but they didn't have anywhere near that kind of money to lend at. Those days were over. The Rothschilds badly receded in power during the First World War and going into the Second World War. And of course, the Second World War was terrible for them. They, many of them fled Europe. They had very little when they left. They had the means to flee, but they still had to run. The Vienna branch of the family was completely gutted. The Paris branch took decades to recover. They had their artwork stolen. Their palaces were desecrated by the Gestapo. Multiple members of the extended Rothschild family were killed in the Holocaust. So the idea that the Rothschilds were, you know, secretly funding the Nazi war machine, they were sitting out the war in their luxury hotels, and you see these accusations in David Icke and Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy. That's just all nonsense. They couldn't be farther from the truth.
And so even though they lost power, you know, and lost, I mean, you know, things move on. You know, people, you know, there's you know, people don't maintain the same power. The Rothschilds is still a wealthy family, but as you point out, they don't really appear in the Forbes wealthiest people in the world list. Like, so, but how do they still say, why are they still a target of anti-Semitic conspiracies and myths? And to what extent are they still that? And how do they?
Well, they definitely still are. They've been usurped by George Soros as the sort of public enemy number one of the wealthy Jewish string pullers, but they are still relentlessly attacked. If you just go onto Twitter and type in Rothschilds, you're going to see all kinds of hateful memes, conspiracy theories, allegations that have been made for centuries. And I think the reason why they are still attacked, even though they've really receded in power and visibility, is once you get used to attacking somebody, you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you want to attack wealthy Jews if you just go after the Rothschilds. A lot of these content creators are very lazy when you come down to it. They want to just write the same thing over and over again. And if there are 2 centuries of attacks and myths and tropes about the Rothschilds, there you go. You don't need to do much more work after that. People attack them because they're just used to attacking them.
And you talk even before Twitter or meme writers about how people continually just ripped off previous screeds, even when it was booklets and pamphlets and actual books. But why do these cycles keep coming back? You talk about the cycles of anti-Semitism. Why, you know, what are the things that make people, you know, every 20 or 30 years or so, you know, come back and want to blame the Rothschilds for whatever, for wildfires or wars or whatever it is, whatever's bugging them at the moment?
Sure. It is a societal upheaval. It is great, drastic events that are not supposed to happen that happen anyway. There are, wars, there are natural disasters, there are pandemics, there are banking contagions, and these things happen in society, and they're very complicated questions. They sometimes require solutions that need to be sort of jury-rigged on the fly, and people are not always good at doing that. People instead want to know what happened, who did it to us, and how we can get back at them. And when you talk about who did it to us, you're talking about scapegoating, and scapegoating and anti-Semitism go hand in hand. Jews are blamed over and over. You go all the way back to Jews being blamed for the death of Jesus Christ to right now and Jews being blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. It's really just another iteration of the same thing.
Yeah, and you talk about in between Jesus Christ and COVID, you talk about a Frampo, which is an important and tragic rail accident, and it just tells us a little bit about that, how they got blamed for that.
So this is in 1846, and this is the time when transcontinental rail is really starting to become a much more prominent way to get across Europe. People who were never able to leave their city and are suddenly able to see other cities. But these trains crash, and it's still a very new technology. And when these trains crash, the papers of the time delight in writing these just horribly graphic depictions of what happens to people. It's tabloid journalism now. We love a car wreck. And there is a crash on a Rothschild-owned line, the Gare du Nord, that happens north of France in 1846 in this little town called Fampoux. It's a very obscure event. And something like 15 to 20 people are killed in it. It's not the worst train crash in French history. It's, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about it, except it is on a line owned by the wealthiest family in France at a time when the underclasses are looking for revolutionary ways to take power, to seize the means of production, as one might say. And so this pamphlet comes out because it's called The Edifying and Curious History of James I, King of the Jews. And James is James de Rothschild, who's the head of the Paris branch of the family, who's expanding his railroads all across Europe. And so this allegation that James's railway is cheap, it's shoddy, it doesn't care about safety, he continues the trains running even after the accident, that's included in the same pamphlet as Nathan Rothschild was at the Battle of Waterloo. So now you have a dual accusation. You have the Rothschilds are manipulating world events for their own gain, and they are using that power to impair the lives of ordinary Frenchmen. And this kind of dual accusation is really lightning in a bottle, and it really takes off in Paris. It sells something like 60,000 copies when it's first printed. It kicks off this massive war of responses and responses to the responses. And it really is one of the first kind of anti-Semitic panics built around the Rothschilds.
And I think that's what's really striking about your book is how you lay out the historical accretion, like these stories are repeated and then put next to each other, and the fact that they have no real basis in fact or truth just doesn't really stop them. They're a great story, and then this becomes a pattern of behavior because you have two stories about the same family, and suddenly, oh, we told you that they were evil, and so they become evil. It's like, well, neither of them are factual. You've made up two stories about people, and they're factual, and this happens in a publishing world. But then you're talking about what happens when you type in Rothschild to Twitter and you get like hundreds, if not thousands, or maybe more of pretty heinous posts. How has the internet changed things, if at all?
Well, it's made everything go faster, and it has reduced any kind of barrier to entry that may have inhibited some people from getting into this world. Conspiracy theorists and cranks excel at early adoption of technology. So it is not a surprise that the earliest days of the World Wide Web as we know it, with the Usenet groups and Yahoo forums and stuff like that, is immediately grabbed up by conspiracy theorists. Alt.conspiracy immediately becomes one of the most popular groups on Usenet. And immediately Rothschild conspiracy theories start up there. So they're churning out the same stuff. They're stealing from the same sources, but now it's faster, it's anonymous, it doesn't cost anything. And we've seen now with social media that anybody who wants to become an influencer in the conspiracy theory world, if they just put out enough work and it has enough ridiculous details, and they seize upon a story that might be of interest to enough people, you can become an influencer and therefore make conspiracy theories your career pretty easily.
So yeah, so there's actual professional, I mean, conspiracy theorists. I mean, you would you say that Alex Jones is a professional conspiracy theorist?
Oh, sure. I mean, Alex Jones has made his living off conspiracy theories since the mid-90s, since this transition to conspiracy theories becoming more popular in the mainstream really started. You had the Clinton conspiracy industry. You had the rise of popular entertainment like the X-Files. Of course, you had Waco, you had Oklahoma City, you had Ruby Ridge, you had all these things firing the militia movement. All of these things kind of mixed together. And it was Alex Jones who took all of that stuff and put it into a very popular medium, which was the early internet. He was really good at it. He was really good at broadcasting. He was very compelling. It's not as compelling now, but he seized on something that was really the domain of kind of street corner cranks and out and out white supremacists, and gave it a much more acceptable, much more guy next door kind of face.
Right, and so you're talking about influencers, but who gets influenced? Like, we're talking about like who believes these myths? I mean, I suspect that our audience today, I mean, certainly you and I understand that these are, I read your book and you wrote the book, so so we understand.
One would hope,
Say again?
One would hope. But
yes, exactly. So we understand that there's a gap between the facts and these conspiracy, and we would hope that the audience also understands that most of the myths of Rothschilds are absurd, and and certainly the anti-Semitism behind them is kind of unpleasant. But who actually is influenced by conspiracy theorists and cranks and Alex Jones? Like who in the world, I mean, apart from Marjorie Taylor Greene?
It's people who are looking for a better explanation than the one they're being given. It's people who are looking at chaotic events that seem completely beyond their control and are looking for someone who is bringing order to that chaos, who is controlling what seems uncontrollable. Conspiracy theories, belief in conspiracy theories really stems from a need for knowledge, for what is going on, why is it happening, who is doing it, and what can we do to push back against them. That's so much of what powers belief. It's not brainwashing, it's not mental illness. I mean, some people do believe this stuff certainly are mentally ill, but you can't diagnose a vast swath of people just based on them being into things that aren't true. And you can believe a lot of these things and not hurt anyone. You can be a believer in UFOs or Bigfoot or crop circles or whatever it is, the sort of harmless old school conspiracy theorizing. But when you take it to a place of violence, when you take it to a place of scapegoating, of defrauding people, then it really starts to become much less of a belief issue and much more of a legal issue. And that's where people get exploited by the gurus, by the grifters, who maybe do not believe all of this, but understand how to talk to the people who do believe it. So I think in so many cases, it's just bringing order to chaos, answering questions, and finding community, finding other people who believe the same thing.
Right, and you actually, although you don't talk about it in the book, I think you actually testified to Congress about some of these tendencies in the conspiracy world, I guess. And and what did you find in DC? Were people generally like amazed that people believe this stuff, or were people generally believe this stuff? Like what did you find when you went there?
It really depended on your political party. I was invited by Democratic staffers who were very concerned about the potential for misinformation and conspiracy theories to influence the 2022 midterm. That was a point where there were multiple Secretary of State candidates who were running, being essentially promoted by a major QAnon influencer. And these were people who were openly talking about how if they had been the Secretary of State, they wouldn't have certified Joe Biden's victory. There was a real fear that we were about to give over the machinery of our elections to people who would not respect it. And I think in general, the country's pushed back a little bit against this. The Republicans did not do particularly well in 2022. These outside, QAnon believing Secretary of State candidates, they all lost. But if you go to the other side of the aisle, you get a lot of questions about Stacey Abrams and Hunter Biden, and do social media companies decide what's true and what's not true? Things that are maybe not quite so relevant to the discussion at hand. And of course, those are people who have their own agenda. They maybe want to get on to Fox News. They want their clips to go viral. So it's not even so much of a conversation, because we're not even talking about the same thing. If one side's taking it seriously, the other side is taking seriously trying to get on Tucker Carlson.
Yes, there's a mismatch of aims and maybe of understanding of representative democracy.
Yeah.
In your book, so one of the most important things about the, obviously the Rothschilds did become extremely wealthy, and there's this great story about the 5 sons going to different places, which is, on the one hand, a beautiful story about a family spreading out and being successful in 5 different places, and on the other hand, well, on one other hand, if let's say we've got 3 hands here, on one hand, it neglects the 5 daughters who also spread out, and on the third hand, from a conspiracy point of view, that gets jumped on as the Rothschilds spreading out and taking over the world. But they were bankers, and they were really important in the flow of money and actually really starting off the technology of banking. And one of the tropes that you talk about frequently is how people say that the Rothschilds are running or own the central banks. And so one of the things you do, and I don't think you're really a banking expert, or maybe you became one.
No, still definitely not a banking expert.
But you had to explain like a little bit of what a central bank is and how this gets taken on. So just to say a little bit about what the Rothschilds get blamed for in terms of these central banking situations.
Sure. So there is a misunderstanding of the basics of how banking works among a lot of conspiracy believers. A central bank is the money regulation and printing organ of a country. The United States has the Federal Reserve. England has the Bank of England. Most countries have the Bank of fill in the blank country. And they're not owned by anybody, certainly not by one family. They are responsible for regulating currency. So the idea that the Rothschilds would own all these banks is on the surface ridiculous, because nobody owns all of them. But the Rothschilds really functioned as a private bank for a long time. If a European royalty or a prime minister, if you're Benjamin Disraeli and you've got the opportunity to buy Egypt's share of the Suez Canal, you go to Rothschild, because Rothschild has the money to lend. Rothschild lends the money at a competitive interest rate. Disraeli pays them back, and boom, England owns the Egyptian share of the Suez Canal, and there you go. Banking doesn't really work like that anymore. And the Rothschilds weren't really able to keep up with the changes in banking. So they receded in power. But the conspiracy theory believers, they don't understand how this all works. And of course, they don't want to understand how this all works. So you get these conspiracy theories that the Rothschilds own all the central banks except in 3 or 5 or 7 or 9 different countries, and we're always at war with those countries. And those are countries like Iran, North Korea, Iceland. I missed the great Icelandic War, but hey, I'm just a sheep. And in reality, these are countries where the banks are completely nationalized. Iceland did actually nationalize its banks during the 2008 crisis. Doesn't mean they kicked the Rothschilds out. Just means that the country took control of private banks because the private banks were all falling apart. There are actual reasons why these things happen, except it's a lot more fun and lucrative to spread theories that the Rothschilds are just in control of all of it. You don't need to understand anything if you're doing that.
Great, thanks. That's and if we have any more questions about central banks, we'll definitely come to you for that. And we're going to come to some questions from the audience
Sure.
now, and people should remember to put those in the Q&A if they have them. But let's just start with this one. Netanyahu met with Elon Musk yesterday talking about anti-Semitism on the platform formerly known as Twitter. This was after Elon Musk had stated that George Soros seeks to destroy Western civilization. And you spoke about how Soros has kind of taken on the mantle of the Rothschilds as being the sort of preeminent mythic Jewish banker. So what role do you think these big tech moguls have in spreading or stopping the spread of these anti-Semitic tropes? And how can they protect us from the rampant spread of anti-Semitism on social media? And then, so that's on one side, and because it's Musk and Bibi. So on the other side, what role does Israel have in trying to protect us from this spread of anti-Semitism in this particular cycle?
Well, the role of the tech companies is something I've talked about a lot. I talked about it a lot with QAnon, where early on in the spread of QAnon, places like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube were just completely baffled by what to do. They didn't understand it. They were moving too slowly. And of course, we saw from leaked Facebook messages that it was Mark Zuckerberg himself who didn't want to suspend Alex Jones because he didn't want to seem too censorious of conservatives. The tech companies are never going to save us from people being on their product. It's just not in their best interest. And of course, we've seen what happens when this kind of speech is unregulated or barely regulated on Twitter. It is suddenly everywhere again. And it's being pushed by Elon Musk, who is tweeting out things like the ADL cost him half the value of Twitter. That is just a repackaged version of the Jews control everything and are destroying my business. You can find countless cranks throughout history doing that. Saying Soros wants to destroy Western civilization. There are completely legitimate criticisms you can have of Soros, of the Rothschilds, of Israel. Absolutely. None of these people or institutions are above criticism. But using these same tropes of they hate Christians, they hate civilization, they want to destroy us, that's not actually criticism. That's just anti-Semitism. You're not saying anything useful or interesting or valuable. You're just rehashing these old tropes. So it really, depends on us to police our own use of social media rather than wait for the tech companies, the US government, the Israeli government, anybody to do it for us.
Yeah, so no one's going to sail in and save us from online anti-Semitism.
No, it really has to be us.
So Tommy asks, what shocked you most about the Rothschilds as you did the research, whether about them or stories that are told about them, I guess?
What really surprised me is how difficult they found it to do business in America. I assumed that when I started really digging into it, that there would be, a Rothschild bank in New York, there'd be a Rothschild Inc. in LA. There wasn't. They had no one working in the United States in 1837 because their agent there had gone under in the panic. And they had a guy who was going to Havana to check on their sugar interests there, I think. Stopped off in New York and he just stayed. And he just hung up his own shingle and started doing business for himself under the Rothschild name. That was a German Jewish banker named August Belmont. And if that name is familiar, it's because his family is the namesake of the Belmont Stakes, Belmont Racetrack. He got very involved in Democratic Party politics to the point where you had pro-Lincoln newspapers in 1864 attacking Lincoln's electoral opponent, George McClellan, as an agent of the Rothschilds, which he wasn't. But this kind of all got bound up in conspiracy theories based just on the fact that he was an agent of the Rothschilds. But the Rothschilds were constantly baffled by America's, the differentiation between federal law, state law, local law, and none of them wanted to move out here. They didn't want to leave their palaces. They didn't want to leave their art collections to move to some backwater where they didn't understand how anything worked anyway. So that really surprised me, just how little imprint the Rothschilds actually had in American business.
And I like the you point out that I think that Belmont's original name was Schoenberg.
Schoenberg, yeah, he did assimilate.
Schoenberg, the beautiful mountain, then became the beautiful mountain, but in French instead of in German. So
it seems appropriate. Yeah, and
how he.
Yeah, and of course the Rothschilds, they didn't change their name. They didn't assimilate. They didn't give up Judaism. Somebody like Schoenberg, or then became Belmont, he did, and a lot of other German Jewish bankers did.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, you stress this in the book, that that as well as being a magnet for all sorts of anti-Semitism, because of their wealth and power, that because they didn't give up their Judaism, because they stayed Jewish and they stayed, I mean, whatever particular flavors of Judaism that they subscribed to, they really did stay the Rothschilds and stayed Jewish, and therefore they became kind of an aspirational family for people like so Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. Yeah, so we know the song "If I Were a Rich Man," but in the original, I think, and certainly in the Hebrew version, it's "Lu Haiti Rothschild," if I was a Rothschild.
Yeah, in the original Shalom Aleichem story, it's "If I Were a Rothschild," and the story itself is kind of depressing. It's Tevye sort of fantasizing about what he would do if he were as rich as the Rothschilds. The first thing he would do is he would get his good Sabbath clothes out of hock. I mean, it's like, it's really sad.
Okay, so I've got some more questions from the guests. So someone asked, how do the current members of the family feel about being the subject of these conspiracy theories?
I tried to find that out and was shut down very quickly. The current iteration of the family does not want to talk about any of this, and past iterations of the family don't want to talk about it. I think where they've come down is they can't prove that it's not true, and the people who would need to hear that wouldn't believe them anyway. So they just don't say anything. They just leave it for others to discuss. I certainly didn't have anyone try to stop me from writing the book, but I didn't have anyone who wanted to cooperate in any way either.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the only two that you actually talk about in recent-ish times, or certainly in the last few decades, was David went on to Alex Jones to talk about climate change.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I really would have loved to have been a silent observer while that discussion was going on. Hey, do you want to go on InfoWars? Like, did they not know what it was? Did maybe he did know what it was and he just said, oh, this will be fun. And if you listen to it, you can kind of tell that he's really amused by how angry Alex Jones is getting. And there's just them yelling at each other for 40 minutes.
Yeah. I don't know whether this is something that's within your purview as someone who's worked a lot on conspiracy theories, but Val asked, what's the best way to talk to people who are either actively subscribing to conspiracies or conspiracy curious and or entertain the possibility of a conspiracy theory?
It's a great question, and it's something that I struggle with all the time, and a lot of other researchers and journalists who are in this world really have a struggle with how to talk to the people who are stuck in this. I've found that if you are dealing with somebody in your life who is a conspiracy believer, just to kind of be there and let them know that you still care about them, that you love them, but you're not going to debate this. You're not going to have a discussion about, do the Rothschilds run the world? Is QAnon real? You're not trying to debunk it. You're not trying to sort of insult them out of it. That's only going to drive them deeper into it. But for a lot of these people, this is, especially with anti-Semitic stuff, really old myths, you just believe it because you've heard it before. And so it is an opportunity if somebody posts something about, the Rothschilds have enough money to feed and clothe every man, woman, and child. You can say, well, no, that's not true. The family never had that kind of power. What you're replaying is an anti-Semitic myth. I think a lot of people don't want to be thought of as anti-Semitic, so they might pull back from that and say, oh, I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me. But if they're a hardcore conspiracy believer, anti-Semite, you're not going to get through to them. You're only maybe going to encourage them to try to wake you up, to want to have some pointless debate with you, I think at that point, you maybe just want to leave that person alone. You can walk away from that person and it's okay. You do not have to rescue the conspiracy believer in your life, but it's a very, very tricky line to walk. And it's very easy to fall off it.
Oh, yeah, so someone asked, will it be, so the book is space lasers and the Rothschilds, and so you've really set up Marjorie Taylor Greene as someone who is although she didn't say Jewish space lasers, she was dog whistling the Rothschilds as
Totally.
wildfires. And one of our audience, Marcia, says, will it ever be possible to reprimand Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Well, she was. I think she was censored and she was removed from her committees. Unfortunately, with the Republicans back in power, I think those committees have been restored. And I think with somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's not even so much the official response. It's that when she says these things, or she tweets out this stuff, or she talks about the gazpacho police or whatever dumb thing she's saying, we then we think it's really funny and we share it because we're going to make fun of how dumb she is. Now, I don't think she is the most intelligent and the most curious person, but somebody like her, she knows how to get attention. She knows how to get people to retweet what she's saying, give her more exposure, give her more clicks, and then let her say, well, look at me. They think we're stupid. They're making fun of me. Oh, I just misspoke a little bit, but they're just vicious and how they're attacking me, and they're attacking you, and they're attacking us. So it's very easy to manipulate social media to get attention for yourself and to make yourself look like the victim. So I think we underestimate people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Lauren Boebert, like Matt Gaetz, like Trump. We underestimate these people at our own peril.
Right. Yeah. No, I think the oxygen of attention seems to be something that it's very difficult to play with, because you in the book detail how people are able to sell tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of copies, and now you get millions of clicks. And so how to deal with people who are either of good faith or of not good faith, and either who've swallowed large narratives or small bits of idiocy. Anyway, so thanks so much to Mike for such a lovely conversation, and of course for a fact-packed
That works.
and engaging, if somewhat sobering, book. And so thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you very much. This was great.